I'll start from the podium. All right, thank you very much for coming. On behalf of Anne-Marie Slaughter, our president, and Peter Bergen, the vice president and head of the International Studies program, today's sponsor, thank you very much for coming to New America. I'm Douglas Ollivant. I'm the ASU senior fellow in the Future of War project here at New America, also affiliated with the International Studies program, International Security program. We are pleased today to welcome Daniel Williams, who's written a very interesting book. Copies available in the back, or I'm sure he's happy if you buy it at any brick and mortar or online bookstore, called Forsaken, on the plight of Christians in today's Middle East. He comes with a long history in the Middle East, having worked as a reporter for numerous outlets, including the Washington Post and the LA Times. Is that correct? And most recently has worked in the emergency division of Human Rights Watch, where he worked particularly on these issues, especially in Egypt, I believe.
That's right. Yep.
So without further ado, we'll turn the podium over to Daniel and let him talk about his book.
Good, thank you. Yes, thank you again for coming. I wrote this book, or I started this book after I left Human Rights Watch, because something I noticed was that despite the emphasis on, even at the time, Iraq and Syria 2 years ago, that there was something happening that was across the region to Christians and other minorities, but I focus on Christians. And I tried to get to the bottom of the idea behind persecutions, contemporary persecution of Christians. I chose the Middle East for a couple of reasons. One is that it is although we tend to think that Christianity was born in Jerusalem, in fact it was born in Syria. The first time they used the word Christian was not in Jerusalem, it was in another place. And all these churches, of which we Americans may have a vague knowledge of, date from the same time as the Roman Church, which we do know about. They were founded, or at least believed to be founded, by apostles of Jesus. So there was that. The persecution and decline of Christianity in this area is also an historical event if it disappears, and I think in some places it might disappear. The other reason, of course, had to do with the amount of conflict in this area. And if you do the math, countries like Iraq, if you go back to the war with Iran, they've been at war or in some conflict for a couple dozen years. Lebanon civil war was 15 years. The war now in Syria is in its 6th year. And what you notice in history is when there's war in this area, Christians and other minorities tend to suffer. They tend to be, for reasons that may have nothing to do with the actual conflict, they pinpoint them as fifth columnists, as traitors, or just people to take your frustrations out. What I found was, in fact, there is a kind of cohesive ideology behind the persecution of Christians and other minorities. As you probably all know, Christians and Jews had a particular status under Islam. But this, like many other tactics and theories of Islam, was changed by the current crop of jihadists, holy warriors. Sometimes they're called extreme Islam. I found that these changes in the status of Christians was promulgated by Salafis and Wahhabis. Now, they're different movements, but they have one thing in common, these two. You know, Wahhabism is the official religion of Saudi Arabia. Salafi is an older movement, but they both have in common that the best way to live and the only way to live is to follow the example and words of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad. They came up with something that I consider new. It's subtle, but I think important. That Christians, indigenous Christians, in this region had no place in the region. even under Islam, because again, the Christians and Jews had a special status as long as they followed certain rules. Now and if you go back into old history, even during the Crusades, most of the time, indigenous Christians even opposed, the Coptics in Egypt opposed the Crusades, for instance. They were having their own dispute with Rome, so they opposed it. And other Christian churches, they were not involved on the side of the Crusaders, and therefore they were not targeted most of the time by Muslims. It would become a problem if Crusaders had big crosses on their chest, and they noticed that the Coptic Church had big crosses on their church, so they could be guilt by association. That changed, and now, at other times of war, now they don't accept the idea that Christians can live there for a variety of reasons. And the Islamic State, this is one by Abu Musab Zarqawi, the predecessor of the current Islamic State, this is the Islamic State of Iraq, in 2004 issued ideological guidelines for how to wage jihad. And they basically cancel this, the status of the people of the book, Christian and Jews, but what Jews? And they say, we believe that we believe that the factions of the people of the book and those of their ilk, which would be other non-Sunni Islamic sects, are today in the Islamic State a people of war, not enjoying the status of protection. This phrase, people of war, it refers, I think, to this kind of apocalyptic view of the world as the world of peace and the house of peace and the house of war. If you live in the house of war, which is we live in the house of war, for instance, according to these guys, you can raise jihad. The idea that Christians living under Islam live in the house of war is a kind of, they're in trouble because it's open season on them. And this, even Salafis and Wahhabis might debate this issue, but of course for many, especially Islamic State people who may be recruits from Europe, just this kind of phrase and this kind of preaching and finding it online is a danger to minorities and especially, in many cases, Christians. They also stack the case against indigenous Christians by conflating their existence with their other enemies, especially Shiites, and in the case of Syria, Alawis, because in the hierarchy of people who are outside the true faith of Sunni Islam, Christians and Jews have certain tolerance for them, but not for Shia and not for Alawis and not for a whole host of other Islamic and not to mention non-Islamic states. So in 2004, again, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was the head of the Islamic State of Iraq at the time, it was killed by the Americans, I think 3 years later, he took the step of linking the Christians in Iraq to the Shia government in Baghdad. And let me add that the Christians pretty much were on the sidelines of things that happened in Iraq from the time of the American invasion occupation on. They were there, but the Americans didn't offer them any protection as a Christian community. The government was rather indifferent to them. The new constitution of Iraq put Islam on a pedestal that upset many Christians. So the idea of conflating the existence of Christians in Iraq with the Shia government or the Shiites is just made up, in my view. And so he said, if the Muslims defeat the Christians and polytheists, which would be other non-Sunni Islamic religions, this causes distress among the Shiites. The Shiites are not Muslim, he goes on to say. They are a sect that follows the path of the Jews and Christians in lying and infidelity. They're just bad people, basically. And he's combined them, and this is bad for Christians. The Christians really are on the margins of this great struggle in Iraq between Shia and Shiites and Sunni. But there they are, thrown into the same basket of deplorables, one might say, with the Shiites. And so it's open season on them. Let me flip a little bit. So the point of my book was these pictures here. On the left, you have a church burning in Cairo. And on the right, you have Iraqi Christians. It's a piece, because what I've said and what Zarqawi and others would say in some ways applies in different degrees to Christian communities elsewhere in the Middle East. So so it's a pan thing. It's not just Iraq and Syria, and I'll try to show that in a bit. This is this thing where they drop the protections, the traditional protections for Christians and Jews, if there were any Jews around. This man on your right, and some of you may recognize, is Abu Musab al-Suri. He has a longer name, but it would just stick to that. And he's a pretty important tactician and ideologue of Islamists in Syria and the Islamic State. Some may know of him because he proposed the idea that jihad could be wherever an individual Muslim exists. When we talk about lone wolf terrorists, it's not unlikely that they are following his ideas that you don't have to have an army on horseback carrying out jihad on the plains of Palestine. You don't need an order from bin Laden or anyone or a caliph to do it. You just do it. It's like Nike shoes. Just do it. And so he also proposes the idea that Christians are a danger to the glory and the mission of Islam. And you see it in this quote. He was talking why Bashar al-Assad should be overthrown in Syria. And why one of the reasons he should be is because Bashar al-Assad wants proper Muslims to that the mores and ethics and so on of Christians and Jews were being forced on Muslims. And he conflates again Christians with the Alawis. As you know, Bashar al-Assad is an Alawi, an offshoot of Islam, but it combines all sorts of religious traditions. In any case, Assad, the Alawis, and the Christians are in league to stop the Muslims from hating Jews and Christians, to wear the clothes that Jews and Christians wear, to emulate their fads, their hairdos, their gestures, their diet, their drink, everything. It requires the Muslims to become like cattle. Especially this notion, you do see across the Middle East. One of the symptoms of, for instance, the burning of churches in Egypt. Churches that display crosses, churches that ring bells, festivals that happen in the streets of Cairo, for instance. These are to be forbidden. Christians don't have a place, an open place certainly, in Muslim societies according to this idea. This book chronicles country by country what's been going on and the variations on the theme of how to persecute Christians. This couple escaped Karakosh, a town near Mosul. They were left behind because the whole way that the towns were abandoned in Nineveh province, where Mosul is, happened very quickly, and then people rushed, and these people, very old, 75 years old each, were kind of left in a house, woke up the next day, and suddenly there were these guys from the Islamic State and also Baathists in uniform running their town. This is a shopping center where they're unfinished shopping center where they're living. There are many stories like theirs. This one was especially touching because they were left there. The Islamic State people tried to get them to convert or go to Mosul and live in an old folks' home. They didn't want to convert. They eventually were let to leave, but they had to walk miles. If you notice the bandages on his foot, it's because his feet started bleeding and dogs started nipping at his feet. Now, this is just one of many of these stories of the flight from Mosul and Nineveh that were quite painful. She was most upset because when she got to an Islamic State checkpoint, they took her earrings. These are earrings that were given to her at her wedding. It would have been 55 years ago, and then she starts crying. And this is the kind of personal thing that made the whole flight from Nineveh and Mosul very painful. Mosul, in our memory, the American memory of things, Mosul was an event somehow separated from everything else that's been going on in Iraq for the past 15 years. And it was just a punctuation mark to an ongoing persecution of Christians that began within about a year after the Americans left. It started with killings of burnings of churches, attacks on clerics. Attacks on clerics are interesting because they in Middle East context, if you kill the shepherd, his sheep will will go away. They'll disperse. Kidnappings, of course, some of it for money. But people in Mosul and Baghdad and other Christian towns where the conflict was heavy had been suffering persecution for 15 years. It's not just what happened in July of 2014. And at the time, after the expulsion, President Obama suggested that these people will be able to go back. When I was in Erbil talking to these people 2 months after the event, it was pretty much sure they didn't want to go back. I mean, we'll see now that what they're going to call the liberation of Mosul takes place. But it should be recalled that Mosul was just the latest thing. It was not the beginning of something. It was not isolated, because the government in Baghdad doesn't pay attention to them. During the American occupation, they were not offered any form of special protection. There's an incident in the book, but it's not one that I discovered. It's been discovered elsewhere, where a woman named Nina Shea, who used to work for the State Department, asked Condoleezza Rice about protecting Christians, and Condoleezza Rice said, no, but there's no we don't accept the idea there's a sectarian conflict in Iraq. And in some ways, Obama has carried this through. And this is on the side. We have this panorama of troops that are going to go into Mosul, and on the side somewhere are these Shia militias, much feared by the Sunnis. Shia militia, in fact, sponsored by Iran. There is a sectarian thing. The Americans didn't recognize that there would be one. When it was happening, they didn't recognize that there was one. They wouldn't act on those things. So no community was protected by the Americans in a special way. Neither the neighborhoods in Baghdad, populated either by Sunni or Shia, not by Christian neighborhoods, Christian villages. And this is one of the many failings of Iraq. Again, there's this sequence of events, killing bishops. There was a killing priest, a Syrian Orthodox priest in Mosul, but this is several years ago. They took him. They demanded $350,000 in ransom. How much did they pay? They paid $40,000 for his release, and they killed him anyway by chopping off his head and chopping his arms and putting them across his chest and leaving him in a garbage dump outside of Mosul. I spoke to a man in Erbil, a quite remarkable person, Father Douglas Bazi. He's a Chaldean priest. And he was hosting a lot of refugees at his church in Erbil, and then he let me on his story of being tortured for 9 days in Baghdad. They wanted $85,000 in ransom. They weren't paying for a while, and he didn't want them to pay. So he spent these 9 days. They withheld water from him for 4 days. Normally you die when you don't have water. You can do without food for 4 days, but water in Baghdad of all places. They eventually beat him with hammers and broke his teeth and broke his nose and broke his back. On the 9th day, they dressed him up in women's outfit to take him outside, and he thought this was the end. He told me. And he had a hood over his head, and there was a man next to him who said, just don't say anything. So they drive around Baghdad somewhere. They stop and they said, jump out. He said to me, I waited to hear the shot. There was no shot. They just left. The parish had prayed. He was freed. He has had surgery in Germany and Italy and in Iraq. And he's now, again, tending to a flock of Christians in Erbil. The Iraqi Christians know this. They may go back when Mosul is liberated, but we'll see. I wouldn't go back, but I'm not Iraqi. Egypt. And Egypt is actually what inspired me to write the book, because of all these things that happened after the fall of Hosni Mubarak, but also before the fall of Hosni Mubarak. This symbol, some of you may recognize it. It's a symbol that appeared in Tahrir Square after Mubarak fell. It's supposed to represent the unity of Christians and Muslims, the cross and the crescent. It dates, in fact, from 1919, a revolt against, a protest against the British occupation of Egypt. And it was a moment of hope, in fact. There are many incidents in Tahrir that showed this idea that Egypt was not a sectarian country. They could live under some sort of civic state in which religion could be neutral, and so on. It didn't turn out that way, which we'll get to it. But what what I did note, because I'd been a reporter in Egypt before Arab Spring, was there was a repeating series of pogroms, the kind of thing where mobs assault a minority group, in this case Christians, throughout Egypt. There was on New Year's Eve, just before before Mubarak, the year before Mubarak fell, a bomb went off at I think it was 2 churches in Alexandria, killed 24 people. There were many incidents that really didn't make news elsewhere, in small villages in central Egypt, in the far south, and even in Cairo. The Tahrir component of Christians was made up of young Coptic activists who had had enough of this. They put their money on a new Egypt. They were they weren't prohibited from going to Tahrir Square, but the patriarch, or the Pope rather, of the Coptic Church said, "Don't go." They went anyway, because in their view, there were only one way to stop this kind of pogroms, because these mobs that would persecute Christians, the police didn't do anything about it. They didn't stop them, and there were no prosecutions after. So it kept happening, and they wanted this new Egypt. So they disobeyed the Pope, which is very unusual, and this is important because, again, in the Middle East, patriarchs and priests, they're the go-betweens, certainly at least since Ottoman times, maybe before, the go-betweens with authority, and suddenly they were telling the main go-between, the Pope, listen, we're going anyway, sorry. They went, Mubarak fell, and then there was this huge outpouring of assaults on Christian communities and places throughout Egypt. Especially in Cairo, you saw that burning church. That was in Cairo. There were other churches burned throughout the length of the country. Some of these mobs, and since I was investigating this for Human Rights Watch, there were several things they had in common. Sometimes it would just be a dispute that blew up into a big religious battle, but the mobs were frequently led by Salafi preachers. And then afterwards, the Salafi preacher, the police would not do anything about this, but they would bring people into what they call a reconciliation meeting, and they would try to get them to settle. No one would be prosecuted, no one brought to court. And generally, the Christians didn't get any, their property could have been destroyed. They didn't get anything out of this. So there were 2 things that the young Coptic Christians wanted to stop happening. One, that these assaults on their community should stop, but the other, that the government should work under the law. Well, that didn't actually happen. The Christians first opposed military rule in Cairo during the transition from Mubarak to the Muslim Brotherhood government, and there was a major event in which 24 Christian demonstrators were killed on the Nile protesting in front of the TV station, and that was, I didn't think about it at the time, it was a sign that the government was no longer going to tolerate Tahrir-type demonstrations anymore. Then they opposed Morsi for different reasons, because Morsi began to suggest there was a sectarian edge to this. This is the elected, I'm sorry if you don't know, Mohammed Morsi, the elected Muslim Brotherhood president of Egypt. He curiously upset the Christians, one by the new constitution, which again elevated Islam to a more formal influence of law in Egypt. But 2, he actually downplayed an attack on Shiites. There are very few Shiites in Egypt, but there was an attack outside of Cairo on a Shiite village, and he didn't really do anything about it. And this actually frightened the Christians, because the Christians are also a minority, although much bigger. They opposed him. And then we come Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the current military ruler of Egypt. 2 things happened. Christians supported it, but millions of Muslims supported the coup. The Muslim Brotherhood, of course, blamed the Christians, and therefore we have another wave of persecutions. And this had the unfortunate effect of tying perhaps in my view, but in any case, the effect of tying the Coptic Christians back to the authorities. And the go-between would again be the Pope, and stop this nonsense of demonstrating for democracy and so on. It has to be said that a lot of Christians, even the young activists, went along with this, as many liberal Muslims went along with this when Sisi took power, because again, Sisi's this coup was backed by millions, huge demonstrations. The true Democrats among the Muslims, and the Christians in in Egypt, oppose this, but they're either in jail. Bloggers, this is very known cases, no. Christians went underground, stopped talking. So you have this cycle in Egypt that when I say the end of the dream was, there was this idea you could have this new state. It ended with very much something looking like the old state. And this, for the younger ones who thought they would have a liberal state, this is a big disappointment. And by the way, the pogroms and the mob activities goes on, especially in the Egyptian hinterland near the town of Minya, where there's lots of Christian villages, and they're subject to pillage by mobs. They're subject to attacks on church, even today, even under Sisi. And the authorities, much like during the Mubarak period, pay lip service. This is a bad thing, but no one's actually prosecuted for it, because the government still fear prosecuting Muslims for these things. Palestine. This is Ismail Haniyeh, the prime minister, the Hamas guy who runs Gaza, and this is a Greek Orthodox priest. The Palestinian situation is very little talked about because the Palestinians don't want to talk about it. It's difficult to get either common citizens, even Christians, unless you're in their kitchen, unless you know them, they will not talk about their issues with the Islamization of the Palestinian movement. What do I mean? At least up to 2000, but especially in a few decades earlier, the Christians felt themselves to be integral to the Palestinian national movement. Why? Because I think in this country, some people don't understand, well, why are the Christians in league with the Muslims and not the Jews? Because after all, Judeo-Christian ethics, don't they have a lot? They do have a lot in common, but the Palestinian history is different from the other countries. Christians and Muslims in pre-40, what is now Israel, suffered the same fate. They were dispossessed of their homes and land, and they left in mass. There's some, of course, as everyone knows, some Arabs stayed in Israel, but sectarian issues was not a primary focus of any Palestinian. They wanted their state back, and of course, maybe the best known, or there were several Christian activists within the Palestine Liberation Organization, was a man named George Habash. George Habash headed the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. He's a pioneer in airplane hijacking and terrorism. There's a monument to him in Beit Zahur near Bethlehem. So they felt integral up to about the year 2000. What happened in the year 2000? The so-called Second Intifada. I guess I better finish, right? The Second Intifada. It's called the Al-Aqsa Intifada, and for reasons of a visit by Ariel Sharon to Al-Aqsa Mosque. But the naming of that was symptomatic of something the Palestinians felt, that the movement was moving to an Islamic motivation. Because Al-Aqsa, while the Palestinian Christians respect it, they know what it is, it's not their thing. They like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre down the street. People in Bethlehem, or activists, PLO activists in Bethlehem, sent a message to Tunis, saying, "Listen, we don't, and to Arafat, not Tunis, to Arafat in Ramallah, we don't want it named the Al-Aqsa thing. We're part of this thing, and this is an Islamic symbol." And they said, "Forget it, we're doing this." What had happened in the meantime? Of course, Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement, had become more powerful. The PLO had to move in that direction. The PLO, in this intifada, created the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, suicide bombers. Christians weren't into terrorism anymore in any fashion, and so they felt marginalized. Then you have the growth of even radical Islam in Palestinian communities. None of this is supported now, and for instance, in Bethlehem, they call it the Hill of the Salafis. I never, in my time, I've gone to Israel and Palestine for a long time, I'd never seen this sort of typical Salafi outfit, the women with the niqab and the men with this sort of tunic and so on. And now you see it. And this frightens Christians. It's not that the Palestinian Authority backs this. It's not, but the longer that thing goes on, the Christians become feared that somehow an Islamic State type group would enter. And in fact, they've had trouble. The population of Gaza shrunk from 3,000 to 1,500 because Hamas is competing with Salafis over who's more Islamic. It's just an add-on to the problems that the Palestinians have, right? Economic isolation, the problems that any Palestinian has. And now they have this problem. So any event that, for instance, happens in towns like El Bira, Ramallah, places where Christians live, or Bethlehem, you never hear about. But they hear about it. Christians being forced to close their stores during Ramadan, not to have any lunch place open during Ramadan. There was, I've forgotten the year, there was municipal elections in Bethlehem, and the council was majority Hamas. This ended when Hamas and the PLO split over Gaza and the West Bank, but nonetheless, one of those guys said we should impose a poll tax on Christians. These are small things, and maybe not the biggest things for Christians, but they feel the breath of a more radical Islam. So that's the panorama. It's from, I didn't bring up Lebanon, which is a different thing. The Lebanese Christians, of course, are warily watching what's happening next door and to see how much of it's going to spread into Lebanon. It hasn't affected the Christians in a violent way, but things like suicide or car bombs in the Shiite neighborhood by Sunnis frightens them, because after all, they had 15 years of a largely Christian-Muslim civil war. What is to be done about this? And because my publisher demanded that I come up with with something, I can't just chronicle this. It's not working like for the Washington Post anymore, where one of my colleagues might write an editorial, what's to be done, but I just tell what's happening. He wanted to say what should be done. Well, there's lots that could be done, and I'll just say at the outset, I'm not optimistic that any of this will be done. I make a special case of the Christians in Mosul because I feel that they fit the classic definition of a people who, an identifiable community at risk that has a well-founded fear of persecution if they go home. They fit. And you should keep in mind, or if you want to keep in mind, that they were expelled from Mosul when the fighting had stopped. It was already under control of the Islamic State. It wasn't that they just fled the fighting. Some European countries have taken them. The United States, the Obama administration seems disinterested in them. The numbers aren't so great that they couldn't be split up among many countries. It would symbolically point out that the Christians, certainly in Iraq, are at risk. But as you probably all know, the Obama administration declared the Christians in the Middle East and Yazidis, another a much smaller minority, are facing genocide, and then in the same sentence said, but we're not going to do anything about it. And just as a side, I covered Bosnia for the Washington Post years ago, and the Secretary of State at the time, Warren Christopher, was very careful not to use the word genocide because he felt it would trigger action. So the word genocide itself under this administration has been degraded by using the phrase and not do anything about it. I found it shocking. Maybe others don't. Syria, it's a different situation. Wars going on. There are many minorities that could claim, and even majorities who could claim persecution. I think realistically, the best that can be done until this war ends, whenever that is that better care be taken of the refugees, that more money be poured, which is not enough has been poured into the camps in Jordan and Turkey. For Christians, there's only one special thing I would ask. Christians are afraid to live in the camps. They won't live in the camps. Their women get, they say, get harassed by Muslims. They're harassed and intimidated by Muslims. The UN, for I suppose some technical reason, will not register people who don't live in the camps. Therefore, they don't necessarily get aid of any sort. They're living with Christians. They live especially in Lebanon, with other communities. That can be fixed, and it would seem to me to be worthwhile to put them in the refugee basket, even if they don't live in a camp. Of course, the real solution is that these wars stop. As I said, Iraq, how many years? You can tell me, dozens of years. Palestine, it's a very low-level conflict, but forever. Lebanon had their thing, and Syria is in its 6th year of conflict. Historically, it doesn't favor minorities of any sort. Jews would be another example. If you think that the Suez War led to the expulsion of Jews effectively from Egypt, a country where Jews had been there for 2,000 years, doesn't favor minorities, and it certainly doesn't favor the Christians. Hillary Clinton's plans for Syria involving the United States, we'll see. But I wrote something not long ago that, of course, being an ex-human rights guy is probably not going to put me in much good stead. I would be content would be wrong. I would be willing to accept the continuation of Assad in Syria if the war ended. This is just my opinion. It's based on nothing else than that. this destruction, which I'm sure you've all seen on TV and so on, and anyone who's been there can see. I mean, no Middle Eastern city has been bombed as heavily as Aleppo ever. Neither Beirut, nor Gaza, nor I don't know what other towns. Never has, and I've been to Aleppo, so because I have sort of a soft spot for this town, which was on its way back, and now it's bombed to heck. What about Muslims? Because, you know, there's this thing where in the United States, critics of Islam say things like, it's all Islam. Islam is bad. This is why this is happening. And defenders say, no, it has nothing to do with Islam. And of course, they're both wrong, effectively. I mean, the Salafis and the Wahhabis use text. They may distort them and so, but it's there. What is needed is, in my view, to identify the sources within Wahhabism and Salafism, speak out more strongly against them among Muslims, and realize, and perhaps this is my most important point if talking to Muslims about it, and in fact Muslims tell me this is what's needed, because Muslims are also victims. It's not like it's just Christians, Yazidis, and Sabians, and who knows over there. Obviously, in Syria, a large number of Sunnis are being persecuted, are being tortured as we talk, and their towns are being bombed as we talked. In other countries outside the Middle East, Shia and in Pakistan, they are also victims. It wasn't always that Sunnis and Shia didn't look for some sort of reconciliation. I mean, the wedding of the Shah of Iran took place in Cairo because the head of Al-Azhar mosque wanted to show that Shia and Muslims were not at odds with each other. It's not, under Islam, there's plenty of texts that forbid things like attacking civilians and would forbid this innovation that I call it of expelling indigenous Christians who live under Islam. I just don't feel that I don't live in this country, so I may miss something. I hear enough from the Islamic point of view that this should be stopped. I'm not even talking about stopping jihad, I'm talking about attacks essentially on civilians. In the Middle East, it's a problem. People who speak out against it are generally also Democrats, so they're usually hounded out by Islamists, and the government is happy that they're gone. And there were 2 Egyptians, one who actually died in exile in Holland, who did this. One was a professor at Cairo University. The professors hounded him out of the university, and then he was under threat, and he left the country. So that's another problem. There's no Islamic political leader that I know, or a political leader who has the moral authority to speak out. Is it Sisi? He killed 800 Muslims in one day in Cairo in August a couple years ago. So there's a real problem there, but I would hope also that the voices exist. They exist in this country. They exist over there, that they would get more, they would have an echo in some way. I don't think any of this that I said is going to happen, including the offering of this administration or the next one of asylum just to the Mosul people if they don't want to go back. So it's all pessimism. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Daniel.
Sure.
A few questions before we, between us here, before we go to the audience. You touched on this briefly, but I think I'm going to push you on it a little harder.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what's the innovation that has changed, that has made it where there is no protected place for Christians and Jews where you can find them? You know, the disappearance of Jews from the region is another story we don't have time to talk about today. But these communities, you know, persecution is nothing new to these communities. You know,
Right.
They've been there for 2,000 years or approaching that, and they've experienced persecution of one kind or another at regular intervals during that period. So this is not new, but facing extermination is new. So what's the innovation in Islam, or is it this just
Salafis and Wahhabis, I don't want to say within Islam.
That has brought the Christian communities to the point where they face extermination?
The goal of these jihadists, of these holy warriors, is some sort of return to glory of Islam. And for a variety of reasons, they feel Islam is weak. Leaders, for instance, who aren't enthusiastic about holy war, for instance. They killed Anwar Sadat in some sense for that reason, for having made peace with Israel, not reclaiming Islamic land. The innovation is that the presence of Israel weakens Islam from within, even under the places where Islam rules. They fornicate. they loan, they drink, their women are uncovered. Somehow this is a temptation. This may seem wacky to us, but this is the way they think. They imagine a pure Islam that had no connection to these other people, which is frankly pretty absurd even in its earliest Islamic history. It's not like the Arabian Peninsula had no other groups, that they didn't trade with other people. They knew these people. They traded, they knew who they were. The Salafis and Wahhabis imagine some pure Islam completely devoid of these influences. These are bad things that weaken our drive to restore the glory of Islam, to retake Andalusia in Spain, to take back Sicily, and to be able to oppose the West in a way that has not been effective. I mean, I have a point. Sunni Islam has been on the defensive, and there's been a series of disasters, which the bombing Aleppo is another one, in a way, that makes them wonder, why is it that we can't respond to this? And their response is, one of the reasons is that we are infected by these groups that were not outside groups. After all, they were there before Islam came to what used to be called Greater Syria and Egypt and Mesopotamia. And so we have to get rid of them, or suppress them in such a way that they can't really be Christians. So like I said, in Egypt, you saw all these controversies over, well, you had a cross. Can't have that. You ring a bell. There's actually a law in Egypt, I think you can't have a church within a couple hundred meters of a mosque. Because this is bad. Muslims are so, it's nuts to me again, but Muslims are so sort of weak in their mind that if they see a Christian woman uncovered, they will not follow this march to the greatness of Islam. So it's a bit of a, even during the First Crusades, they weren't assaulted. There was a famous sermon given in a mosque in Syria. He talks about need to do holy war. He doesn't even refer to the invaders as Christians. He refers to them as Franks because they came from France. And there was no persecution of the Christians. In the Fourth Crusade, I believe it was the Fourth Crusade, when, yes, some of the Armenians, this is all very complicated. Some Christians joined the Crusaders. And this was really when things really turned tough for the Christians. The Mamluks took over, an Egyptian group, and they began to view Christians as a fifth columnist because the ones on the Mediterranean coast had joined with the Crusades. And some had joined even with the invaders, the Genghis Khan types who were invading from the east. And that actually, I'm sorry, it's the 13th century, not the 4th century, the 13th century, there were other invasions. And they began to view Christians as possible outsiders. But they're not. In Iraq, these people did not invite the American invasion. The Pope in Rome sent an envoy to George Bush. Don't do it. We're going to be hurt by this, and the country's going to fall apart. George Bush, through his aides, said, what do you want? We're with you on the issue of abortion. Go back to Rome. And then some colonel or general who'd taken this envoy named Cardinal Pio Laghi out to the car said, it's going to be easy. Snap, right? They didn't invite the invasion. They weren't, yes, there's some Christians, because they spoke English, worked with the military people, but so did other religious groups. They're not in league with the Shia in Baghdad. They're victims of the Shia in Baghdad. Syria is a little different because, they're more or less, it's my impression. Someone here may have a better idea. I didn't see any polls of this. Anecdotally, in conversations, Christians would have been happy with the reform of the Assad regime. They wanted the Ba'athist idea, which is a kind of identity not based on religion to stay in place. But once early in the war, Christian communities were not only invaded, but for strategic reasons, but for just fun, churches were being burned and looted and so on. The Christians, in some sense, if they had some doubts about being with Assad, those doubts are pretty much thrown away. But the idea that the presence there is the bad thing for Islam is kind of the basis for this.
So, having led you down that road of talking about this innovation, couldn't one say that you're really almost looking at this backwards, that it's really about a genocidal movement in the Middle East that persecutes Shia, Alawi, Yazidis, Shabaks, Druze, any Jews that they could find, in addition to the Christians, and you're really just focusing on one particular subset of a larger whole of trying to purge everyone who's not like them.
How would you respond to
Well, that's right. I did write a book about Christians. But in the book, you'll note I apply this ideology, which I've tried to lay out, to a wider ideology, which includes, and of course it's mentioned, attacks on Shia and other, especially Shiites, because there's this fear of the Shiites especially, and other groups by the radical or the Salafi jihadists. It's when I quote from Zarqawi and al-Suri, these quotes are not from just a special treatise on Christians. It's a larger piece that includes all these things that you say, attacks on Shia and others, but also how to wage jihad, how to act. So the Christian problem that I point out here, of course, is a problem for other minorities, but it's also a symptom of what you say, a genocidal movement, and also a movement which believes that attacks on civilians is okay. And of course, this has been shown in Europe and in this country. You don't have to, again, take your orders from al-Suri to blow up, to kill a bunch of people at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando. Just do it, is what I say. And I do want to be clear that, of course, when I suggest taking Christians from Mosul, I'm not trying to exclude on human rights grounds other groups. You know, this country, the president of this country has a lot of power to take whoever he wants, in a way. During the Cold War, we took Jews from the Soviet Union. There was no war going on. So I'm not suggesting, like Angela Merkel, we can take everybody, but the human rights laws and resolutions should be applied properly. That's where the Republicans got it wrong, right? Exclude Muslims. No, that's not the thing. But Obama also, well, Christians, it's just, no, you know, it's just random. We just pick them randomly. That's not so. That's clearly not. When Hillary Clinton says you can't tell the difference between a Muslim and a Christian, that's wrong. I've never met a Christian named Muhammad, and I've never met a Muslim named George. And they all have those names. And the Christians belong, at least from Ottoman times, to close-knit communities where there's baptismal, you know, there's no technical reason on the case of Mosul not to take them. On the others, it has to be, I don't think Angela Merkel was right to just say, oh, come on, but there are ways to do it and ways to also ameliorate the suffering of all these minorities, especially the Syria case, where Alawis, Sunnis, Christians, and Druze and others have all fled, either internally or externally.
Finally, and for this, I did warn Daniel I was going to ask this question. I'm just back from Berlin. I was in Berlin with the Future of Iraq project, sponsored by our friends over at the Atlantic Council. And we met with representatives of almost all the Iraqi minorities there, met with the Yazidi, met with the Turkoman. But most relevant to this conversation, we sat down with the Patriarch of Babylon, Patriarch Louis Sacco. He, of course, has a very different picture and solution, he thinks, for what should be done. He has, very famously disciplined his priests who have left the country and refused to come back. He's very concerned about preserving the Christian community in Iraq. He talks about it, as you said, in terms of bearing witness. But I think if you flip that, what he's really concerned about is that if this community disperses, that it will cease to exist as a community. That if part of this community goes to Germany and part to Kurdistan and part to the United States and part to wherever else, that it will, after a generation or so, cease to exist as a community as it intermingles with the host community, that without a critical mass, it simply won't be able to survive as a community. So in some sense, doesn't he have a point? Does the evacuation of Christians, in some sense, complete the project that ISIL and other movements are trying to bring about of purging Christians from this land and making sure that these communities cease to exist, not by exterminating them, but by denying them the coherence to maintain themselves culturally?
Yeah, I agree with everything he said. But it should also be pointed out that they're leaving anyway. They were leaving Iraq before. They were leaving Palestine in large numbers before, and all. But I don't actually dispute anything anything that you say about them. The question is, if you're a Christian from Mosul, can you really be treated as part of a project? Your house has been taken. Your business has been taken. Maybe family members have been killed in past, because I say Mosul was just the end of something, wasn't the beginning of something. I brought this question up, of course, when I was in Erbil talking to the refugees, but also to priests and so on. Now this was only a couple months after, so I can't say what's happening today on the eve of the liberation or whatever it's going to be of Mosul. The refugees I talked to said they were not going back. Why? Their neighbors had turned on them. Everything was taken. These people arrived in Erbil with nothing, including the old. You had anything, they took it all. They'd lived through 15 years already from the occupation. This was not, in their view, anymore a passing chapter. So the question was, and one of them said very bitingly, the hierarchy, this kind of the patriarch, is deceiving us. And Father Bazi said, they can't live in dignity here in Iraq. So what's the point of being a Christian in Iraq? So I would only argue, if I was going to argue, but I'm not a member of any of the Eastern churches, that you say they'll be dispersed. They won't have this critical, that's right. But in Iraq, they won't be able to worship. They won't be able to do what they do. So what kind of Christian life is that? And that was Father Bazi's point. They can't live in dignity anymore. They may be able to survive in Iraq, but they can't live in dignity anymore. So I say they should be given the opportunity, this Nineveh Mosul group should be given the opportunity to emigrate. And if they do, fine. I can't see them as extras in somebody else's movie, including the movie The Hierarchy. The Pope himself, of course, hasn't really said you should stay or should leave, but they're also, in Rome, they're also against the members of their associated churches over there from leaving. This issue of bearing witness in the birth of Christianity, it's very important, but I ask you all, if this had happened to you and you'd seen priests tortured and you'd seen people, would you go back? Maybe. This is, of course, the great Christian, martyrdom. Christian has martyrdom. Go back. Let's go back to Mosul and maybe they'll kill us, but we'll be dying for Christ. Well, there are saints, but not that many.
Thank you. With that, we'll go to the audience. I know there are a lot of people both from the region who've worked on these issues, so we'll start. When I call on you, if you can please wait for the microphone. Please identify yourself and any relevant affiliation, and please make your comment in a form of a question. A question usually has a who, what, where, when, and ends with a slight lift at the end of the sentence where you can hear the question mark. With that, we'll start here in the front row, please.
Nizar Farzakh, I'm a Palestinian consultant who works on leadership and advocacy. And in fact, I did research this summer on interfaith dialogue in Palestine. Interesting, but also very disheartening. So thank you for an even worse, more disheartening talk. But I think it's very important. I think it is very, as a Muslim, I think it is very important. And my question has to do, if you can elaborate, having spoken with a lot of these Christian families in different regions, what would amount to actions from civil, I would argue it's civil society, Muslim civil society that needs to do this and not the people in authority. Right. What are actions that need to happen so that Christians feel they can live with dignity? And allow me just to give just examples of what it is not, in my opinion. So for example, the great challenge that we face for minorities in the Middle East is precisely that they're pitted between being complete citizens and then getting transgressed, or getting protection from an authority that's very unpopular, right? So when the Copts in Egypt refused the quota system that the British suggested, right, they now regret it, for example, right? Similarly, in Palestine, there is this association, unfortunately, because they feel persecuted. Having said that, there are also a lot of misconceptions on the Christian side of what Muslims are about, and what and often what the feedback I kept getting from Christians was that it's not enough for us that Muslims say, oh, this is not Islam. We're still getting persecuted. And here, the final thing I want to say, do you think it's useful, because there are initiatives in Iraq and in Palestine of people, Muslims, who realize that that's a problem. So there is an NGO in Iraq that actually celebrates minorities and takes activities to celebrate all sorts of minorities in Iraq, And likewise, there's an imam in Bethlehem that I think is arguing from the right side, who's saying we as Muslims cannot claim that, teach our kids that Christians are our brethren, and in the same breath say that Muslims are going to heaven and Christians are going to hell, because you just taught your child that you are more important than the Christian, right? So what is the kind of conversation that needs to happen inside Muslim societies so that that mentality to begin with doesn't end up with persecution? Thank you.
Well, you know, each country has its own peculiarities. As I pointed out, in Egypt, the Christians, Muslims, especially young people, did move together. They were organized. You know, there's a tendency to view Tahrir Square as just a big mass of a bunch of Egyptians. That wasn't the case. It was quietly organized. And it's similar in Palestine. The Palestinian society is generally organized, although Yasser Arafat did a lot to suppress a lot of these organizations, which really gets, I think those organizations could grow in any country, and that's interesting what you say about Iraq. But as I pointed out in the Egyptian context of Muslim writers who wrote about, in the way that you're talking about, trying to treat them as brothers and in the case of one, criticizing the Salafi focus on texts out of context. For instance, there's a thing called the Pact of Omar. Do you know what the Pact of Omar is? The Pact of Omar is a treatise from the early days of Islam when they took a town and they made a deal with the Christians not to kill them until you had to do X, Y, and Z. And the Islamic State tries to apply this now, and as one Muslim told me, but the Pact of Omar is not the word of God. It was the 7th century. So, this is the 21st century. So why are they applying the Pact of Omar exactly as written? I would say one problem they have, NGOs, and even in Palestine, although probably the PLO, Palestinian Authority, is in favor of this imam in Bethlehem, is that this kind of liberal thought is also a threat to the government. And therefore, it's difficult for these NGOs. It's difficult for human rights organization. It was a very brave one in Egypt that still exists, but those people are kind of in hiding, that took up this issue and printed in Arabic issues of Christian persecution during Mubarak's time. And of course, they've been run out of the country. So I think when I say Salafi and Wahhabi, these are minority sects and minority ideas. You know, Egypt is a Sufi country, and we may not focus on that very much, but Sufis that's not me who knows about the Salafis and Wahhabis. It's Muslims who know about Salafis and Wahhabis. But you rarely hear it pinpointed that way. It has to be pinpointed, but you also would need governments that will tolerate this kind of liberal thought. And it doesn't happen. So good luck, even in Palestine.
Next. Woman in black, please.
Hi, I'm Nermeen Riyad. I work with Coptic Orphans, and we're an international development organization working in Egypt, an NGO, and we're doing a lot of things, Christians and Muslims together in the communities. My question to you is, you have 15 minutes with the Coptic Pope of Egypt. What would you advise him?
Not to have stood shoulder to shoulder with Sisi on the day he overthrew Morsi. That's past. Well, I would have if I had 15 minutes, and then I would tell him it was wrong. Now, no, I understand the position of the popes, and they work from a tradition, at least from the Ottoman Empire, but perhaps before, of being the go-between, because that's the way the Ottomans ran the empire. I would hope he would go back to, or be sure to defend the young people who went to Tahrir and were in favor of a civil state. He's pretty much thrown in with his lot, as have many Muslims, with Sisi. But he knows what's going on. Some of those guys who were something called the Maspero Youth Movement, you'll know what it is, but maybe you guys, there's a fairly large group of Coptic young people, 20-somethings, who were the ones who went to, or helped organize their presence in Tahrir. He should stand up for them. Now, it's risky. And there's a whole interest of the church that may be different from people in Minya and so on. Wouldn't be the first time the Pope countered the government. With Sadat, there was a big dispute. I guess I have a place in my heart or head for those Christian Coptic youth who were in Tahrir, who wanted a really civil state in which this real equality that this gentleman was talking about would take place. And I would hope the Pope would stand up for that and not sort of say, as not he's saying, but others around him say, we told you so. We told you not to go to Tahrir. We told you not to get into this stuff. That's what I would tell him.
Thank you.
He was not inviting me, though, to tell him anything. So.
The gentleman in black here in the third row. Thank you.
My name is Philip Farah, and I'm really speaking for myself. I do belong to Washington Interfaith Alliance for Middle East Peace, but I am speaking for myself. I frankly I'm a Palestinian Christian, and I have more family relatives in Damascus than anywhere else. And because we all left, and we all left because of the Israeli occupation. And I take issue with your statement that Palestinians don't talk about these things. They do talk about these things. And there's a lot of...
in Palestine or outside?
Everywhere.
Okay.
There are discussions in the media, in the Arabic media, including Christians and Muslims who criticize the Salafis and others very severely. But we are very wary of being portrayed as being, in a vise. Because we do still, you said, and I thank you for that, that the Christians suffered exactly the same issues in 1948. We still suffer the exact same issues. And, Hamas has not burnt any churches in Gaza, which is where my family is originally from. Israel has burnt churches. Israelis have burnt churches and have not been taken to task for this. The question I'd like to ask you is, from the perspective of my family and my relatives in Damascus, they view the U.S. role as having been always, supportive of regimes and groups which have played, Islamic Salafis against progressives in the Arab world, have used them. Mubarak has the Saudis, the Islamic League, and all of these things encouraged Wahhabism, and are now effectively working to again, from their perspective, to destabilize a regime in Syria which has protected them, and basically siding with al-Nusra, which threatens them nearly exactly as much as ISIS. I'd like you to address that.
Yeah. Well, if I'm wrong, and if in the Palestinian territories this is a subject open debate, I'm sorry, and you may be right. In my research, I didn't really hear much about this, and I was told by the Palestinians that the Palestinian Authority did not want this issue to be not discussed but emphasized in any fashion. But if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. As far as this American policy, or policies generally, of course the American governments, various, have had inconsistent attitudes toward human rights in the Middle East, many places, but in the Middle East. So of course it's added to a lot of cynicism and feeds, since '67, feeds a narrative of people like the Islamic State that the West can't be, well, maybe since the fall of the Caliphate, but the West can't be trusted, they're devious, and so on and so forth. So I would like, and I'm speaking for myself, a more consistent policy, of which there's never been. They tolerate when they want, and they don't tolerate when they don't want. I mean, again, in Egypt, which is a country I worked a lot in before I went to Human Rights Watch, Condoleezza Rice came to Cairo, lots of speeches about human rights. And then congressional testimony here when they sent this people from the State Department and Pentagon, well, the most important thing for us is the Suez Canal, the peace with Israel, and the other relations they have with Egypt. For the Egyptians, this is just two-faced nonsense. And what you say about Nusra, and this is a whole larger subject of who does Obama back, or who did he back in Syria. There's no question. Money was flowing to groups that were of the kind, not the Islamic State, of the kind that the Islamic State is. If you remember the beheading of the Palestinian boy in what town? I forgot what town it was. Was it Aleppo? I've forgotten. Halab? What's it? Yeah, a Palestinian boy. This was done by a group that until last September got money from the U.S. government. So this isn't good for what you say, and this inconsistency, and in the case perhaps, you should probably address this more. It's clear the administration doesn't know what it's doing in Syria. I'm not sure it knows, as dare I say, what Donald Trump says, that they know what they're doing. So yes, I pretty much agree with you say. The consistency in Human Rights Watch would be, maybe I'm not a purist, but a little more consistency would be useful.
Very good. Since you're right there, the gentleman in the jacket there, yes.
Thank you so much. Flavius Mihes, I'm a consultant at the World Bank and independent journalist. I was actually in Iraq in December 2014, and I had the chance to meet with Father Bazi. And there is a little, very short documentary that's online with my interview. To follow up on our friend last question, indeed, I was in Damascus in August last year, Damascus, Homs, Sednaya. And when you sit in the living room with the Christian in Damascus, and they frame the geopolitics of the region as Israel has been detrimental to the Christians, Christians have fled or have been persecuted since the creation of Israel, the US is supporting Israel, and therefore it's working against our existential interest. It's pretty quite a breakthrough, at least, to understand their position. And I wonder what you think of that perception of the Christian in the Middle East toward Israel will affect, in fact, the US and the West willingness to help them more substantially. And number two, in Homs, one of the Syriac Orthodox priests described the beginning of the uprising in Syria as Salafist backed, Salafist through the television channel, the mosque. And I asked him, so were there claims that the regime ignored or choose to answer by force? He said, no. The people went on the street for Assad to replace the mayor. He did replace the mayor, and then quickly enough, the people were coming out of the mosque, funded by Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the preacher, and then we were next. And I wonder and that seems to be so irreconcilable with the sort of mainstream perception you have here in Washington about how the uprising started. And I wonder, slightly different from the Christian, but I wonder what credence do you give having hang out with those guys in the region? Thank you.
I'm not sure I understand the question on the first one, so I'll answer the second one first, and you can try to repeat it. The sectarian aspect of the Syrian civil war did show up very early, even in Daraa, the town in the south. Still, the government responded generally to demonstrations with violence. So while it was there, it wasn't necessarily it's not just a totally terrorist, which is what Bashar al-Assad said, run uprising. How it could have turned out differently, I can't really figure out. If he hadn't, I mean, his position is if he hadn't killed, I thought he killed 16 people very early, and that really made the thing explode, if things would have been different. So I don't really have the answer. Of course, some, not a few, clerics from Syria very much are firmly on the Assad Ba'athist sign. That is the formal ideology of Ba'athism is what they like. And it has to be said before the civil war that Assad, his wife in particular, was patronizing the Christian communities in Syria, maybe out of conviction or this was a good thing. I don't know. But at this point, and I don't know when you spoke to this priest or bishop, Christians are firmly, there's no question, they have nowhere to turn. Where could they turn? This is a problem of minorities everywhere. Where would you turn when you're under direct threat from a group like, or from the Nazis for that matter, or from, you're a minority. You need the Christians in Iraq have no patron, in my view, neither the Baghdad government nor anybody. But the Christians in Syria, for better or worse, have a patron, and his name is Bashar al-Assad. And that's where they stand. What was the first question about Israel? I didn't quite understand.
Yeah. Affecting the U.S. policy toward the Christians, because some of the Christians, at least in Damascus, will tell you, as the gentleman said before me, Israel has been working against the interest of the Christians. Christians in Palestine have been persecuted, killed, expelled from Palestine since the beginning of the state. We see that as an imperialist power, and the U.S. is backing it up, and we're against it. And I wonder if that narrative is, in fact, frightening perhaps the U.S. and other policymakers when it comes to reach out and help that community, the Christians.
I don't hear so much of that kind of talk on Israel's somehow conspiratorial involvement in what's going on. That may be a belief. I don't find it myself. I can add, though, that in the book there's a brief Palestinian Israelis or Christian or Arab Israelis, whatever you call them, also have a problem of feeling that their place in Palestinian society is under threat, not only from the Islamic movement among the Palestinian Arabs or Palestinian Israelis or the Arab Israelis in Israel, who of course want to impose Sharia if somehow they took over all of Israel, but also from fundamentalist Jewish groups who live in the West Bank who have burned, who have defaced churches and vandalized cemeteries. So they're feeling a little bit isolated, not in the same sense that I think West Bank or Gaza, the few people who are left in Gaza who are Christians. But I can't really, this notion that the United States are working against Christians, I don't actually know anything about that, and I kind of doubt that that's a real framework for what's going on.
Great. Brian, up front.
Hi, I'm Brian Katoulis with the Center for American Progress. I want to thank you for the book, and I encourage everybody, buy it.
Yeah, buy it.
Don't borrow it.
Buy it, yeah.
It's an online publisher, so you have to actually go online to get it. You can't go to Barnes & Noble because they say they can't make any money if they go through a bookstore. Go ahead.
Yeah, my question is a little bit back here. I know you're just starting to talk about the book, but how do you expect the different communities to react to this, what's going on here? I mean, we've done some work at the center that I would say people haven't paid attention to. We put out a report on this issue, and some of the churches, I think, were interested in it, but we're in this malaise in the Middle East, you know, and general sort of, I think Obama's posture, which is, I think, deeply unfortunate, reflects where America is at. So I share your pessimism about the lack of any movement. I know in 2014, I was called into the White House on one of their endless deliberations on Syria. And one of my friends, who's one of Obama's closest advisors and very religious, I gave him a St. Jude medal, which is the patron saint of impossible causes. And Jude was killed in Syria. And I said, I know this is an impossible challenge, but what can you do? And how do you sort of address these issues back here? And he basically said, we're not getting any heat in any way from a lot of these organized constituencies. I think people just see this as, I fear will read your book and just say, yes, you know, like you've concluded. There's nothing we can do, and I refuse to actually believe that that's the right conclusion.
Well, like I said before, I think both the Bush administration and Obama administration refused to publicly identify this issue at all. When I think Obama was in Turkey, and there was a time when Ted Cruz had said, only Christians, no Muslims, and Obama used a phrase that I found kind of deceptive. He says, we have no religious test for our compassion, referring to the Christians. Which is the idea is we couldn't just accept Christians, even the ones from Mosul who were already in place. But anyway, and I found it deceptive because, of course, we have no religious test for our compassion. We love everybody. And Obama, of course, loves everybody, as probably George Bush loved everybody. The religious test, of course, comes out of the Constitution, has nothing to do with our immigration law or any constitutional provision at all. So this failure to even recognize the problem is really the obstacle. He may say, wait a minute, but do they, they can't even, like I say, when the genocide thing came out, the State Department, yeah, genocide, but Malesh, we don't do anything. But of course they could do something about genocide if they felt it was really genocide. Of course, I've noticed I don't live in this country, but the campaign, fantastic. Of course, this issue hasn't come up in any fashion. Hillary Clinton, as I once said, well, how can we tell the difference? And Donald Trump, who knows? I don't know. Did he build a hotel in Ramallah? I don't know, maybe. So one step would be getting them to recognize that there is an issue, not just with, of course they, remember on the genocide thing, it was going to be Yazidis only. And Yazidis certainly suffered. And perhaps worse than the Christians because of the kidnapping of women and rape and so on. But I don't see that, certainly nothing will happen now, and whether Hillary Clinton wants to take, what needs to be, let me go in a larger sense, because it gets to the question of the Shiites and all these other people who are, the Western powers have to sit down and realize that they're dealing with a different kind of refugee issue that was even extant in World War II. Germans were expelled from all over Eastern Europe, from Russia and other countries, and there was a Germany to go back to. And there were two, in fact, but there was a Germany to go back to of Germans that accepted them. They were under occupation, but they accepted them. it's not very clear, and not only in the Middle East, that some of these countries are a place you can go back to. I think the Christians in Syria, no matter who wins, are going to have difficulty. My impression of the Iraqis is there isn't, well, is there an Iraq? Can we actually say there's an Iraq even today? They don't want to deal with the refugees from failed states. Somalia is another one. There are plenty of them. The Africans are coming into Italy, not from Syria, but from other failed states. What to do with refugees from failed states? The possibility that Iraq will never be Iraq, I mean, it's 15 years already since the American occupation. It's going to be longer than the Lebanese one, and much worse, if you can imagine. That's what has to be dealt with, not just for the Christians and others. Can Christians be expected in Iraq, if the war, the civil war continues, and if the government doesn't reach out, of being forced to live in Iraq, where they will have, for perpetuity, a well-founded fear of persecution? I don't think so. I don't know what's going to happen in Syria, but boy, the idea of reconciliation in a country like this, where hundreds of thousands have died, and cities, whole cities and parts of Aleppo have been destroyed, don't think so. And no one deals with that subject, so.
Thank you. In the second row, you've been very patient. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Like the previous questioner, I would like to, my name is Ted Blanton. I'm a historian and writer based here in D.C. Mm-hmm. And like the previous questioner, I would like to sort of ask you about what can be done and that would maybe test your pessimism in some ways. So it seems to me from your presentation that the persecution of Christians in the Middle East is very tightly bound up with the Sunni-Shia rivalry, at least in Syria and Iraq, probably not Egypt. But you were talking about the need for voices within Islam. Specifically, it's going to have to be Sunni Islam who are speaking out against Wahhabis and Salafis. And the question that popped into my mind when you said that, and that this is the first thing I would like to ask you is, why not Turkey? Why not Erdogan? Why can he not play that role? Because it seems implicit that you didn't mention him, that he's not playing that role. And then the second part is why Kurdistan? Why is it Erbil where they're being they're fleeing to from Mosul? Why are the Kurds in particular providing this safe haven? And what can the Kurds do possibly?
Yeah. On the first one, of course, there is, could Erdogan, does he have the moral authority? Possibly he still has, despite what's been going on. He probably could. He came to Egypt after Morsi took power and warned Morsi not to overreach, not to go for some sort of Sharia state. They didn't pay attention, but still. So possibly, and it wouldn't have to be in the Middle East. I did say there's no one in the Middle East who has this kind of authority. And I don't want to let Iran off the hook either. The book mentions Iran, but only briefly, that the religious freedoms, they'd also be paladins of this thing. And it is, of course, tightly wound up, the persecutions are wound up in the Sunni-Shia rivalry. But let's face it, there's like 50, there's a couple hundred Shia in Egypt, and it also happens. So it's not just that. It's a larger picture of what should bring glory to Islam. And again, Sisi fights it, but is he a liberal? Does he believe in the civil? In the summer of 2011, there's a small incident. The temporary cabinet that was running the government in Egypt under the generals who took over from Mubarak published constitutional guidelines. They really tried to define what Tahrir Square was about, because it hadn't been defined. There were a bunch of people with different agendas. They tried to do it. And one of the items was creation of a civil state. Now, I didn't exactly know what that means, but it means something very specific. The creation of a state that is religiously neutral. Well, the Muslim Brotherhood knew what it was, and they protested, as did the Salafis, and there were no more joint demonstrations anywhere in Egypt, and that thing never saw, that was it. They put these guidelines out. It didn't happen. The Constitution is not like that. So it is, of course, wound up in this battle between Sunni and Shia, but it's not limited to that, in my view. Because after all, the Islamists began their their steady prominence in 1967, the war between Israel and the Arab countries. And that was before Iran was in the picture in this context, no?
And the Kurds?
Oh, the Kurds, sorry. Well, the Kurds have been pretty good. But I would attribute that to the fact that throughout Kurdish history, Kurds come first. In Sulaymaniyah, I believe it's Sulaymaniyah, or it might be somewhere else, there's a big statue of Salah ad-Din. And I asked the Kurdish friend, I said, well, hey, what about Salah ad-Din? You guys don't really talk about him very much. I said, yes, well, he was too interested in Islam. This was Hoshar, I won't say who it is, but it was, he was too interested in Islam and not Kurdistan. They're pretty much interested in Kurdistan. So they've been good. It's interesting because they don't just take Christians, they take Arabs. And that for them must be a source of some tension given the history under Saddam, especially of expulsions and Arabs in, Arabs out, and their expulsion of Arabs from areas inside what do you call the zone where they, whatever it was, where you can't, Saddam couldn't fly. Where would the
no-fly zone.
The no-fly zone. I didn't listen to Hillary the other night. The no-fly zone. So they're doing it, and they've been pretty good. But as a permanent solution, I don't know if they want the continuation of Sunnis coming into Kurdistan.
Okay. Front row here?
Sir.
Well, please wait for the mic.
Thank you for your talk. Dawood Amoon with the Heritage Foundation.
Uh-huh.
And it seems like the governments in these countries are overpowered by the religion. As you mentioned, that a lot of the governments fear prosecuting a lot of Muslims who persecute Christians. So considering that, what do you think U.S. can do in changing that ideology, changing the mind of the government, of the people, like regarding the people? You know, they fear the people. That's how much precedence Islam takes in these countries.
You know, I don't think there's much. Again, I go back to my call that they have more consistent attitudes on human rights. And the American policy is inconsistent, and not just in the Middle East. That might help, because of course, let's say take the Egyptians again. I mean, they're very cynical about the attitudes of Americans to human rights, of which this is part of. And to put it in human rights terms, because after all, Egypt and all these countries have signed human rights conventions, it's not like they're alien to this. That would help. A lot of this lack of prosecution, it's just, they consider it messy, the central government, messy to prosecute Muslims. And part of the problem is the police themselves tolerate it. On a local level, it's not like some conspiracy, it's not like Sisi says, let it happen. It does have the one positive byproduct for these governments to make the Christians more dependent on the people who are not defending them. And I don't know if the Americans can really do anything with that. I would just say they should press in a consistent fashion, stop changing their minds on some issues, and this would be one of them. That they should protect all citizens regardless of religion. Just do it. Yes,
Very
sir.
good. And our last question will be here on the aisle. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Alex Jalabi. I'm with the Tahrir Institute. The question is the inclusion of the Salafis in Egyptian parliament and the church burning that you have a photo of on the cover of your book allegedly was prompted by the Salafis and not the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yep.
And now we see in parliament representatives of the Salafi party and not the Muslim Brotherhood. Which is, what would that, how do you kind of assess this in terms of potential sectarian issues?
Right. Yeah, I have a confession to make, and one of my former bosses is in the room, so it's a real confession. No one expected in the first parliamentary elections after Mubarak for the Salafis to get 25%. We knew they were there, but they were that organized, and they basically got it, as I understood it at the time, was that they ran on a strictly anti-corruption campaign. Since then, I think what the Brotherhood is out, of course. I think is possible, and this wouldn't be the first Arab government to do this, that the government views the Salafis as their next domesticated Islamic movement. Hand out the Qurans, do your clinics, have a food center, which is what they had, the Dawah had up in Alexandria, and be our Muslims, be our Islamic movement. This is not the first time. This happened a lot. Saddam let Salafis into the country and began to preach during the years of the American embargo. Even Jordan. Anwar Sadat released the Muslim Brotherhood from jail to face off with his leftist opponents, his Nasserist and leftist opponents. The idea that you can use Islam for that purpose has always struck me as wrong, or at least you can see instances where it just was backfired on the very governments. I mean, after all, Sadat was assassinated by an offshoot of the Brotherhood, not the Brotherhood itself, but someone else, and he is the one who brought them out into the public square again. So I view it that the Salafis are probably going to, they're not going to speak like the Brotherhood, they're not going to act like the Brotherhood. Sisi probably sees them as a domesticated group, so he's not anti-Islam per se. What their role will be, because I don't really know what the role of the Egyptian parliament is at this point. We're very much back in Nasser's times, I would say, even more than Mubarak times. They're going to not let a movement grow up like the Brotherhood. So it doesn't help, but like I say, the persecution of Christians continues by mob rule, not by the government so much. And so I don't see them helping in this regard. They may complain if the government actually prosecutes leaders of mobs and so on who loot or kill or have fights in these villages and towns. I don't see it as useful, but I think it is useful for the government to have them there as a tent. After all, Sisi doesn't believe in political parties, but he believes in a big tent of all Egyptians, and so the Salafis are there. That's what I think.
Great. We have just a few minutes. I intend to end on time, but if you can give essentially the elevator pitch of how you see this problem and what you think the solutions are.
Well, I sort of laid it out. What we're going to enter, since I'm visiting the United States and it's surrounded by this lunacy, that is the presidential campaign. I would hope, and it's also mentioned in the book, you have two recent events, but there have been many more, where the U.S. government embarked on a military adventure without thinking about the consequences. Iraq is well known, but Libya is also well known. You know, I didn't want to come off as criticizing the next president, but I remember Hillary Clinton on the day that Gaddafi was killed. She was on NBC and someone asked about this pretty brutal incident. I'm not a Gaddafi follower, but after all, it was pretty awful what they did to him in the desert. And she said, we came, we saw he died, and laughed. That same day in Sirte, 50 Gaddafi followers were summarily executed with their hands behind their back. I hope that the next president, who will probably be her, will be more judicious in their judgments about what we do. She's talking now about a no-fly zone. She's talking about this, that there are consequences. I'm not going to say that's going to resolve all the problems I have, because this, again, Islamist movements have been growing in fits and starts since at least 1967, and in various times before that. But I hope in this country that our policies over there take into account all the possibilities. I just don't feel that like there's a meeting to say what could go wrong after, certainly not during the Bush administration. And I don't think during Libya. They thought, well, Sarkozy's going to take care of it. Huh? I don't, the French, I don't think that's a way to make decisions. There's no such thing as a clean war. There are consequences. There's consequences to the conflict in Palestine. This fight is now being sort of on the side. Certainly the invasion of Iraq, the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq under Bush, the helping of the rebels in Libya. That's what I feel is missing in American policy, the what if. Should Gaddafi have been overthrown? Gaddafi had turned over voluntarily, even though under sort of threat because of the Iraq war, he turned over all his nuclear weapons. That's been a priority for the United States. I think he suffered from numerous things that made him unpopular with governments in France and England and the United States. Should he have been overthrown? He had voluntarily done this, as nutty as he seemed to be to outsiders. I work for Human Rights Watch. It's very difficult to say that things would be better under Gaddafi, but could they have been worse? I don't think it was a judicious decision. In fact, Hillary Clinton, when she was pressing for it, according to this pretty good New York Times article, made her decision on a meeting in London with some Libyan guy in a tie, who said, "Oh, and well, by the way, we'll protect human rights." And she said, her aide said, "Well, they're going to do all the right things." I don't know where those guys are now. They're probably in London. And is that all they knew about Libya at the time? So that's what ended with that the promiscuous use of force ought to take into account what will come after. And that might help. I don't think, if Putin thinks he's helping the Christians by bombing the hell out of, excuse my language, bombing the heck out of Aleppo, I don't think he is. You know, they may think that, but you know, any Middle Easterner here in this room knows that the consequences of these endless wars, and not all fomented by the United States, wars among the things and the internal conflicts in these countries, have not had positive, I can't think of one that's had positive result.
All right, again, we thank you very much for coming to New America today. We thank Daniel for being here, and we strongly encourage all of you, either here or watching online, buy, don't borrow the book.
That's right.